Hi, this is Jack Stanley again. I wanted to talk more on the whole thing about recording and records and stuff like that. I've been on a tangent on this, and so I wanted to continue. And I wanted to talk about some of the unusual and remarkable things that we don't think of so often when it comes to the recordings that we like and collect. We forget sometimes the difficult processes involved in making a record. You know, when it came to making records in the old days, until the age of tape, one might say, which not going to really happen to the late 1940s, um, everything had to be done perfectly from beginning to end of that recording. It's an incredible thing when you think about it, that you had to give as perfect a performance as possible. Um, and you know, we're imperfect creatures. You know, how many times have we done talks or sung songs or did performances and did it from beginning to end as perfectly as possible? It's really kind of amazing. It makes you want to take your hat off, in many regards, to these early performers who not only were working in extremely trying conditions, but also in between these trying conditions needed to sing as perfectly as possible. Now let's just take a look at some of these things. Now, there's some singers that made an awful lot of records. You know, you think of a singer like Henry Burr. Harry McClaskey was his real name. Um, Billy Murray, Irving Kaufman, the various vaudeville quartets, you know, the Peerless Quartet, the American Quartet, the Shannon Four, or the even earlier would be the Haydn Quartet or Haydn Quartet, whichever way you want to say it, because they changed the spelling due to the fact that people kept saying it wrong. But all of these individuals would go to recording studios with an orchestra. They'd have to do a rehearsal. They'd have to make a wax recording on disc of their piece. If it was being on disc, if it was being done on cylinder, they had to do the same thing. They had to play it back and listen to it, find out how well it was mixed. There's no mixing. There's no electronics. There's nothing. That's the amazing thing with all of this. It all had to be put together. It all had to be set up in a kind of a ragtag fashion. You see, there are other factors that humidity, temperature, and other things would affect how the recording would come out. And so a recording done perfectly in a studio, perhaps everything was flawless. Everyone was in the right spot. The conditions were perfect. The next day you would come in. It wouldn't be the case because the humidity had changed. The factors for making the recording had changed. So that was the trials that many people had to go through, and we often forget that fact because I'll tell you, it was no easy affair to make a record. You know, I remember years ago someone describing making a record as a well-orchestrated and organized elevator. It's like in a small room, everyone's crammed together, and they all have to project into that horn, or the series of horns that are set up and taped together, working their way into a main horn, and that would go to the cutting head. Another thing is, of course, many of these great old singers, let's just say Henry Burr, Billy Murray, let's use them for an instance, they would sing a song, let's say for Victor. Then they would go to the Columbia studios and sing the same song. And then they would go into New York City, and up on Fifth Avenue, there were countless studios of the various other companies, and they would work from studio to studio to studio, recording the same song Perhaps they might even make 12 different versions of a song if it was a real popular one. And of course, some of the singers would become basically exclusive artists, like for certain companies. Like I must say that Columbia did that for a while, and Victor did it for a while as well. And of course, everything would change as time went on when musical styles changed. But think about how incredibly difficult it was to make a record. You know, going back to the earliest of days on the cylinders, when there was no mass production, you needed someone that had lungs of iron and a voice like a hog caller, and they would sing into perhaps 6 separate horns of 6 separate machines and make records. And then, of course, they found different ways of making pantographic copies for cylinders. And finally, in the 20th century, they found a way to mold cylinders altogether. The other thing with the disc record, let's go to Berliner or the early Columbia or Victor or G&T. Any one of and Zonophone, let's put those in too. Any one of these companies making records, and if it was even in a wax system, they had a system where they set everything up, made the recording, and was able to make a matrix, and from that they could make one stamper. And after that stamper was gone, it was over. They had to do it all over again, which was difficult at times. They started at G&T and Victor making copies by stamping the stamper into a wax blank and then more or less repeating the process and making another record of that piece that they had a copy of. Now, there's certain inherent flaws that would come with this. Of course, since they did that, the stamper, which was a bit worn, would make it a worn stamper to begin with for the next stamper. Okay, it would be as worn as the one that made the copy. Also, all the inherent flaws and markings on that would be there as well. And so also sonically, it will have lost a lot. But it worked, and that's what they did. I mean, there are certain G&T recordings you'll notice quite often. You'll see CO on the wax. That means copy. Victor was a little bit more secretive about that. They didn't let you know things were copies until later, around 1915 or so. They started something called S8, which meant it was a transcribed record. But you wouldn't know that anyway unless you would know the reasoning behind it. But if you find a record has S8 on it, that means it's a copy. And so it will not be sonically as good as a first generation recording. That would be second generation. So think about this when you play one of those records again. Think about how difficult it was. They worked on their music. They made initial recordings, and then they moved everybody around so it would blend better. Then they'd make another recording and see how it sounded. Once they were happy, the singer and the orchestra or piano player were pretty worn out. Then they would make the performance. And sometimes they would make several copies. So they'd have like 1, 2, and 3 stampers of a song. By that time, the singer was pretty well wiped out. By that time, the orchestra or the soloist or whatever they were pretty wiped out too. There were massive amounts of alcoholism in some of these early performers, and some of the old pianists as well. And, of course, once again, as I said, in those early days, it was kind of hit or miss, because you will notice when you listen to some of the really early stuff, they let things fly that they wouldn't years later. First off, they didn't care about blasting. Sing as loud as you like into the horn. It didn't matter. They didn't get into this blasting thing until later in the 20th century. And so when you listen like to opera singers or whatever, you can hear them in a very different fashion than you will hear them later. because actually what they would do is train the singers to back away from the horn when they were singing a loud note, or a band, if it was playing a really loud part, they would kind of turn their horns a little bit away from the recording horn. So many different tricks that were done, so many different practices, and it was all part of recording, and it was a wild adventure. I think that someday some enterprising individual should make a movie or a mini-series about the beginnings of the recording industry. If you think about it, all the various confrontations, rivalries, theft, piracy, and the like that was all going on at that time. And in amongst all of this were all these new and beginning companies that were trying new things, new ideas, new techniques. And what the end result was were some pretty amazing recordings if you think about how difficult it was to make them. We really need to take our hats off to those in the early days of the recording industry.